Good morning and welcome to yet what should prove to be a very topical and very timely EMET webinar. As all of you are most probably aware, on March 27th in Tehran, China signed a sweeping $400 billion deal with Iran, which is to extend over 25 years. And in exchange for that, they will probably be getting a steady supply of petroleum. Of course, neither the People's Republic of China nor the Islamic Republic of Iran are great lovers of the United States of America. China is not, I think, ideologically concerned here, but they are very involved in their Belt and Road Initiative and their hegemonic ambitions. An 18-page document obtained by the New York Times last year included deepening military cooperation, potentially giving China a foothold in a region that has been a strategic preoccupation of the United States for decades. It calls for joint training and exercises, joint research and weapons development and intelligence sharing, all to fight, quote, the lopsided battle with what they deem to be, quote, terrorism, drug and human trafficking and cross-border crimes. As Americans, we should be deeply concerned. And as those who care deeply with the welfare of the state of Israel and her newly formed friendships among the Gulf and Sunni Arab nations, we should be even more concerned. $400 billion can buy a regime such as the Islamic Republic of Iran a tremendous amount of nefarious mischief. Just how worried ought we to be about this recently agreed upon deal? And what, if anything, can we do about it? Here to answer these questions are two of the policy community's greatest experts, Carice Witte and David Goldman. Carice Witte is the founder and executive director of SIGNO, the Sino-Israel Global Network on Academic Leadership, an Israeli policy organization that specializes on China-Israel relations. Having led over 1,000 briefings in China and Israel, she established a semi-annual China-Israel and annual China-Israel-US track and a dialogue in 2017. In 2011, Carice founded the Israel Studies programs at universities across China, including an annual program held in Israel for Chinese faculty on teaching Israeli studies. Ms. Witte has authored articles, research and policy analyses papers on Sino-Israel relations, trade policies, strategic communications, and global Jewry. Her research focuses on Israel's perspective and Xi Jinping's thought and its potential implications for the Middle East, Israel, and China's foreign policy. David Goldman, who I always feel it's a treat to have, is deputy editor of Asia Times, where he's written the Spangler column since 2001. He is the author of How Civilizations Die in 2011 and You Will Be Assimilated, China's Plan to Sino-Form the World in 2020. His 2020 book, You Will Be Assimilated, was praised by Deputy National Security Advisor K.T. McFarland, who wrote, quote, if you read just one book about how China plans to make the 21st century theirs and what we can do about it, read You Will Be Assimilated. He contributes to the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Claremont Review of Books, and other publications. He has consulted for the Defense Department's Office of Net Assessment and for the National Security Council. He is also a trained classical musician, and he writes Tablet Magazine's music column. So how worried ought we to be about this deal? Carice, why don't you go first?
Okay, so I have to give a disclaimer. I was under the impression that you wanted David to talk about that, and I was going to talk about China and Israel relations. However, I'm very happy to start off with my views, which generally are in line with David's, but we'll hear what he has to think in a moment I'm really grateful to be here. I want to thank EMET for this fantastic invitation, and I couldn't ask for a better comrade in arms on the panel. I agree with you about David. He is endlessly a joy. So the fact of the agreement between China and Iran needs to be taken in the context of how China does business. And I think we need to remember that when it was leaked over the summer, it was leaked by the Iranians. The Chinese were quiet about it. I will tell you that it was actually leaked the year before that, when I happened to be in China, and I asked my colleagues about this because, of course, I was the Israeli security experts who were with me, and I were all very disturbed. And they knew nothing, and they really had nothing to say, and we weren't really sure what that meant. But the subsequent months revealed that nothing was there. Then, when it leaked in last summer, my view was that most of it would not happen because China would be getting everything it wants. I mean, that the signing would not happen because China would get everything it wants from Iran regardless. I stand by that, and the signing itself really has very little to do with the relationship with Iran and much more to do with China's relationship with the United States. After Anchorage, China was hurt, upset, frustrated, indignant, and one of the things that it was going to do is say, okay, we're going to do what we want. You want to tell the world what to do with Iran? We're not listening. We have our own agency, and we will pursue our interests. So they signed it. Now, what did they actually sign? It was announced by both the Iranians and the Chinese that they were signing a roadmap because an official agreement would have to be published. And one of the things they did not do is tell us what's in that agreement. Everybody who writes about it is referencing what was leaked. We really have no idea what the actual agreement says. From my experience with China, the agreement is in their interest and not in Iran's interest. There were protests in Iran leading up to the signing of the agreement and afterwards because the people of Iran, I don't know how much you're aware, but they're very frustrated with the relationship with China because they feel they're being taken advantage of on a regular basis because China has the upper hand. China is, David's going to correct me, it's a buyer's monopoly when it comes to Iranian oil. And no one else is going to, no one needs oil the way that China does, even India, no one in the world, which is relevant also for the Gulf. People say, oh, China's dependent on the Middle East for oil. Well, actually, the Middle East is dependent on China as a buyer. And China has that leverage, uses that leverage, is wise and careful about how it does it. And so I would say that I stand by the fact that everything that China was going to get in through this deal, they would get before, during, after, regardless, because they have a tremendous amount of leverage. Why is the signing a good thing? Because it alerts everyone to what might be taking place. It wakes up the Israelis, the Americans, the Gulf, and presses them to ask questions or causes them to press the Chinese, asking questions of the Chinese. Hopefully the Jewish community in the United States is asking the Biden administration what's going on actually in that situation. So I will basically summarize by saying we lost nothing. We only gained by the official signing. And now the question is, to what extent does Iran, is Iran going to be willing to give up for China, and to what extent does China want to take responsibility for its relations with Iran? One example, the leaked agreement said that China would have oversight over all energy revenues. That would put China directly responsible for Iranian expenditures in Yemen, in Syria, with Hezbollah, with Hamas, etc. Now, it's possible that China would find a way to make adjustments so that it didn't look like they're responsible. But my sense is that there are many things that were leaked in that agreement that are not going to happen. And it's better that it's on the table than under the table and that everybody is aware of it. So with my remaining 10 minutes, I want to talk about the China-Israel relations on a broader level. And I want to give a little bit of insight into my perspective and where I'm coming from. And I also want to, I hope that this will help you understand a little bit about the Israeli mindset. So when I would tell people 10 years ago that Signal was doing China-Israel relations, they said, you're a bridge between business, between China and Israel. And because of course there is nothing else between China and Israel than business. And when I said, well, actually we do academia, they said, oh, sigh of relief. You do student exchange. Well, actually we do neither. I formed Signal a decade ago because I wanted to strengthen Israel's position with China. This meant redressing misconceptions and misunderstandings that were created by 60 years of essentially no relationship with China, no Israelis in China. And Beijing, the government, getting all of its messaging about Israel from scores of ambassadors from Muslim countries. So it was clear to me that China needed a more informed understanding of Israel, and not only for the current decision makers, but also the future, which is why we set out to establish Israel studies at the university level in China. Because if you think about it, 5,000 years of China's history, according to China, there was never a single course on Israel, ever, until 2011 when we launched our first one. With respect to the policy community, we felt it was very important to bring them an accurate understanding of Israel and the Middle East. And to clarify why this was so important and such a challenge, I want to take a step back and tell you that I made Aliyah in 1987 when Israel had no relations with China. I was a newly committed Zionist, and I left everything behind, including China, to make Israel my home. And only in 1992 did Israel and China formally set ties. When I got here in 87, it was the first terrible intifada. I was here for the Gulf War, where every time a missile came towards Israel from Iraq, I raced my toddler and my baby. I put my baby in a baby gas tent, my toddler in a gas mask, in a sealed room. And then I was here also for the very horrific Second Intifada. And during the Second Intifada, I made a promise to myself that I would help contribute to the strengthening of Israel. Then in 2009, when I had the opportunity to do that, I came to the understanding that the things that caused what I just described were so far from China's potential for understanding. Because you're talking about a country that had a one-child policy for 30 years. The idea of sending your only child, your most precious thing in the world, to blow themselves up for a cause was completely unthinkable. Generals who I spoke with on a regular basis, they could not internalize this as a battle concept. In 2010, when China became the second largest economy and decided to become the world's innovators, it was clear to me that they would be coming to Israel for innovation. That meant that bridging their understanding, because they do not have a Judeo-Christian background, nobody necessarily thinks about that, that their background is Confucian and Taoist, Buddhist, communist, etc. So there's a great need to bring these understandings of our region from a perspective that gives them a hook to hang their hat on, that they can understand. We talked a little bit about the energy situation. So one of the main interests, of course, that China has in the region is energy, but also the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an expansion of their general interest in selling markets. But in this case, in addition, it's building infrastructure, and through that, it has become the potential for a geostrategic, geoeconomic, global effort. And we do see that China has done outreach. There's now not only the maritime Silk Road, the land Silk Road, but also the health Silk Road, the space Silk Road, the digital Silk Road. We know that China came out with the digital UN, which was the first small step, and David may laugh at me, but it's the first small step towards a potential for weakening the dollar. Now, not replacing the dollar, but weakening it and providing solutions for countries that would become more tied to China by using the UN, such as throughout Africa. You have a digital solution. It prevents a lot of theft and this and that on a day-to-day basis, and it creates affiliations. So what are the core challenges in dealing with China for Israel? First of all, manpower. And I would say probably, this does apply to the US, it applies to every country. Israel has to pick its battles because our resources are very limited. China is the only country in the world with 350 million educated adults who are ready to work hard according to the plan of the leadership. It's also the only country with a leadership that plans in an organized fashion 5 years, 25 years, and 100 years down the line. And it's the only country that has both of those things and the money to back its interests and its efforts, which makes China a unicorn on the geopolitical level. So if Israel has one government official wearing 10 hats, which I'm sure many of you have either experienced or thought about, given how things work in Israel, in China, they have 10 people for every single job, at least. They have the resources to be everywhere all the time, which means when they say that they are less interested in the Middle East, we ask ourselves, then why in 2016 did China become the #1 investor in the Middle East, especially during a period of time when China had reduced its investments in other places? Another thing that we need to pay attention to is that China has very different kinds of tools to achieve its goals. And when I say different, I mean different from American, Western, Israeli style tools. You may have heard of the United Front Work Department, and do you want to give me a high sign when I should quit?
Right. Just if you could wrap up. Okay.
I will wrap up.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So Israel is critical to China for innovation and technology, our geographic location for the Belt and Road Initiative, as a potential bypass to the Suez. We are also important to China for the US relationship that we have, which is used in several ways. And we're also considered to be very important because according to China's government, and they've said this to me directly, no country can do anything in the region without Israel's okay. And because Israel is a military superpower in the Middle East. Of course, you do need to ask yourself, if Israel's a military superpower, making it necessary to speak to Israel and get its okay for things you want to do in the Middle East, then what is it China wants to do? On that note, I will say thank you very much. And there is an infinite amount more to say. I'm sorry that I ran over time. And David, I apologize.
Okay, thank you. I have a lot to talk to you about during the Q&A, but now, David, if you'll take it away. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks for the kind invitation. I should mention that I've had the great honor to serve on Signal's advisory board these past 7 years. So Carice and I have worked together for quite some time. I'm very worried about China in the Middle East. Not because China has a specific objective in the Middle East as such. China does not have a Middle East policy, it has a global policy. We tend to play monopoly in foreign policy. We say, okay, we're going to get this hotel and put our piece on it, and then we collect rent. The Chinese play Go. They look at all the pressure points in the world from a top-down standpoint, and US-China relations are in an extremely dangerous phase. I'm not a great admirer of Henry Kissinger in many ways, but I think he's absolutely right to warn that there are parallels between the current situation and the years before 1914. China is an empire, not a nation. Whenever the central government has been weakened and rebel provinces have broken away, the human cost has been horrific. And from the standpoint of any Chinese dynasty, including this communist dynasty, The nightmare scenario is a breakaway rebel province. There should be absolutely no doubt that China, in its view of the world, views Taiwan as a rebel province and will view any attempt by the West to establish the independence of Taiwan as a hostile, warlike act against China and will respond with force. And the same is true with Tibet. The same is true with Xinjiang. So from a strategic standpoint, when the West unites to complain about human rights abuses by China in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, whose treatment at Chinese hands is, from a Western standpoint, utterly repugnant, the Chinese think the West is trying to subvert us. This is the old Brzezinski strategy of using Muslims to try to destabilize us the way they destabilized the Soviet Union. And it didn't help that the Trump administration in this last month of office removed the terrorist designation for an organization called the East Turkestan Liberation Movement. That's the Uyghur organization abroad. So from the Chinese standpoint, they have many objectives in the Middle East. The most important one is the old Don Corleone motto, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. They're extremely concerned about Turkey because the Uyghurs are Turks. They speak a dialect of Turkish. The Turks in the past have characterized Xinjiang as East Turkestan, as the Uyghur separatists now do. So their objective is to bribe and bully Turkey into allowing them to do what they do in Xinjiang. From the Chinese standpoint, we've been squishing barbarians on our borders for thousands of years. What's new about this? What are you objecting to? This is who we are. It's what we do. So don't talk to us about human rights. That's had mixed results, but Erdogan, for the most part, has been behaving himself with respect to the Chinese, partly because Turkey is near broke, its currency is collapsing. The Chinese have put a certain amount of money in. That's quite important. The Chinese also have an objective with another big Muslim country, namely Pakistan, which is to scare India and keep India permanently off balance and eliminate the possibility of India being a strategic threat to China. At the beginning of the year, the Turkish and the Pakistani foreign ministers met in Islamabad. This was discussed at great length in the Chinese media, among Chinese think tanks, as a new alliance, which would then force Iran to accommodate itself to this Chinese sphere of influence between Pakistan and Turkey. That's quite important because if the Chinese were to establish through diplomacy, through arms agreements, through the Belt and Road infrastructure building, a Chinese sphere involving these three countries, that would be 300 million Muslims. That's as many as the Arabs altogether. They contain all the important universities in the Islamic world and a great deal of the military power. The two biggest military powers in the Islamic world, of course, are Pakistan and Turkey. So the Chinese view is, well, we kind of force Iran to accommodate. Now, what do they want from Iran? Well, that depends what they want from the rest of the world. It's perfectly possible that China would assist Iran in getting nuclear weapons in order to keep the West off balance. It depends on how they view the West's intervention in Taiwan and other places. It's a strategic option they have. And one thing that also worries me is the Chinese have a very exaggerated view of Jewish power in the world. They tend to, Chinese recall the old joke, the canonical definition of a philo-Semite. That's an anti-Semite who likes Jews. In general, they like Jews, but they believe all the old stereotypes about Jewish power, Jewish finance, and so forth. So frightening the Israelis to try to convince the Israelis to use the influence the Chinese think the Israelis have in Washington on China's behalf is also an option. As Carice mentioned, China is deeply involved in Middle East oil, by far the biggest customer of Saudi oil. China doesn't want a war in the Persian Gulf, much less a nuclear war. Chinese think tankers have claimed that the Saudi Iranian dispute is really an imperialist effort to keep countries apart who should be part of a harmonious sphere led by China. They seem to be quite happy about the recent thawing of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So the Chinese also do have a limit. China is less dependent on oil than South Korea and Japan, at least imported oil. They produce 85% of their energy domestically, but they're still, because they're so big, the largest customer of Middle East oil. So they don't want a war. They might wish to threaten it. Their main objective, what China wants to do, is become the dominant economic power in the world. This is my book, You Will Be Assimilated, China's Plan to Sinoform the World. And the Middle East is also a gateway to Western Europe. The Belt and Road Initiative that Carice just mentioned has built railroads across Asia. Rail traffic has doubled in the past few years, and given the constraints on shipping, this is an extremely important lever that China has for Germany, for Poland, for many other countries that are on the other side of Central Asia and are now, by the way, the largest trading partners of China. China is a bigger trading partner of Western Europe now than the United States. So China wants to dominate what it calls the fourth industrial revolution. It wants to dominate Eurasian trade, and it wants to fend off Western efforts to meddle in what it sees as meddling in its internal affairs in Xinjiang. It wants a free hand to deal with the Uyghurs. It wants a free hand to intimidate Taiwan. The last thing I'll say, because everyone's talking about it, the digital yuan. What China is talking about is not substituting itself for the United States as the center of the world monetary system. It's talking about creating an entirely different system. As Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan said in his annual shareholders letter, banking is going to be transformed. Conventional banking, deposit-taking banking, is going to disappear. Why? Because with the Internet of Things, with 5G, broadband, with artificial intelligence, big data, you can track every package, every product from factory to mine to warehouse to container, and know where everything is at all times, which means you can use the kind of digital payment system that consumers are used to using for Starbucks, for international trade. And that means that the $30 trillion or so of deposits in the global banking system, which are dedicated to financing international transactions, won't be needed. They will shrink. Just the way that writing a check at the supermarket no longer exists to use some kind of electronic payment system, the American dominance of the world banking system for international payments will shrink because the technology will make it unnecessary. And that will put China in the center of a new kind of technological order, a new monetary system, which will shrink American power, also make it very easy to get around American sanctions. So in my view, the key issue, to summarize, is the deterioration of American-Chinese relations and the highly dangerous perceptions on both sides of hostile intent, and the way that Iran might exploit its open-ended and still vague relationship with Iran to put pressure on the West and put pressure on Israel. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so actually, after hearing both of you, I've had a lot of insomnia about this and other issues relating to Israel and the Middle East, and I actually am even more worried now. What you had said, Carice, is lovely, and thank you so much for trying to be an ambassador of goodwill for Israel to the People's Republic of China. I appreciate that. But it's extremely troubling what you had said in terms of their manpower, and even more troubling, because of their efficiency, and also their long-term strategic goals, as opposed to the United States, where we seem to have strategic goals that turn 180 degrees from administration to administration. They don't waver. It has nothing to do with politics. After all, they are a communist regime. So now that we have signaled to the world, especially through our withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is not conditional upon any behavior, but it's calendar determined, that we are withdrawing from the Middle East in no uncertain terms. How do you think our allies and friends in the Middle East, China and Iran, are taking this message that we've telegraphed so loudly? Carice, and then David.
So it's a very important question. China sees the US as in decline. It sees the West in general as in decline. At least that is the message that it's putting out. When I say China, I don't mean all the leaders, all the people in the leadership, all the Politburo, or all of the party, 90 million party members. But the key decision makers who really matter are pushing out that understanding. They are being told, be careful, because the people have predicted the failure of the United States in the past, and they've always been wrong. But there's a lot going on behind the decisions of China that have to do with its own domestic challenges and difficulties, and trying to convince the world and the Chinese that the West is declining is a way of strengthening China internally and pushing forward President Xi Jinping's aim for national rejuvenation. So something none of us really generally pay attention to. This is a very core idea, which is being supported by the pullout from Afghanistan. Here's an example, and here's another example, and here's another example, and the January attack on the Capitol and a lot of the killings, and then Xi Jinping was having a talk with the European Union, and they were criticizing China regarding Xinjiang and the treatment of the Uyghurs, who, for those of you who are not familiar, they're on the western section of China, 22% area of the country, but only a teeny 22 million people in the country, in that region, and half of them are Uyghurs. But there is supposedly re-education camps. Some people are calling it a genocide. So the conflict over that caused Xi Jinping to tell the Europeans with facts and figures how anti-Semitic Europe is and how Jews want to leave Europe because they have gotten more and more scared of life in Europe. And don't forget the Holocaust. So who are you to throw stones? And so you see a new China. This is a China that did not exist 5 years ago.
Right. David.
We have very limited options after having really shot our bolt on what President Trump called endless wars in the Middle East. The American public has absolutely no appetite for spending more blood and treasure in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. And President Trump reflected that, and I think that's become a consensus. But we can't cry for spilt milk. I mean, we do have limited options. There are three or four major powers in the region. The two biggest powers, of course, apart from us, are Russia and China. India, to some extent, Turkey to another extent. And those are the players who count. In a very small way, the Europeans might do something, but the Europeans aren't interested in getting involved in a scrap. President Trump's view was that we could work with the Russians to stabilize the region, and that might help keep China at bay. In a sense, we've got a choice. Right now, by putting sanctions on both Russia and China, we've kind of forced them together, and there's a great deal of talk about a Russian-Chinese alliance. That's what Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon did their best to avoid. And that's not a good outcome for the United States. A Russian-Chinese combination against the US is the worst outcome we could have. So in a sense, we have to make a choice. I believe that Reducing paranoia with China is a good thing, but we're not going to get a commonality of interests. We can have a limited agreement with Russia, for example, on stabilizing Syria and containing Iran. And I believed for many years that our interests in the Middle East are much more important than our interest in the Ukraine, and we could trade those off with Russia to keep Iran at bay. India could also be an extremely important factor, particularly in Afghanistan, where it has some interest. So instead of trying to assert our own moral superiority and beat everybody up, which is effectively what we've been doing, we tend to push Russia and China into a corner against us. I think we have to exploit the potential divisions between them and maneuver as best we can. There are some, of course, who think that the United States should back Turkey as a counterweight to Iran. I don't think that's a particularly effective policy for a number of reasons. I don't think the Turks could be trusted, and we're much better off dealing with a maneuver among superpowers.
Wonderful. All right. So now I'm going to turn the podium over to our wonderful director of EMET's program for Israel's national security, Benjamin Weil. Benjamin, you'll read the questions that have come in.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And I want to thank our two panelists as well for their time and insights right now. The first question that came in is, does the new relationship between China and Iran impact in any way the relationship between China and Israel? And if I can add to that, is given the tension between Israel and Iran, from a Chinese perspective, what role can China play in solving this issue other than just sitting around the table at JCPOA?
Carice, do you?
Yeah, first of all, we Signal have been pressing China on this matter since 2013. We made a special trip funded by one of our donors to, the Chinese say the Iranians are not crazy and they're not fanatics. They're putting on a show to get to the table with the big guys. And that we, Israel, don't have to worry. That would never happen, all the things that Iran threatens. So people had tried to convince the Chinese that it was real, and they failed. And I said, let's take a different tack. Let's explain to the Chinese that it really doesn't matter what the Chinese think. It only matters what we think. And that if we have a knife to the jugular, we will act in a way that will create such a conflagration, because if our choice is to be bombed or and obliterated or fight and suffer in a fight, of course the latter is preferable. So that's the knife to the jugular. And if that's how we feel, we're going to do that. And then guess who's going to not get 6 to 8% of their oil, because it's going to be such a mess here. And the Chinese, I took a very senior diplomat and a very senior member of the IAEA, Israeli, who presented firsthand material. These Chinese, these generals, these party officials, these government officials had never seen firsthand material. They always get third, fourth, fifth storytelling. And they said, what can we do to help? That process began and then ended when the relationship between the Obama administration and the Netanyahu administration led to a clear global message that Israel was not going to be allowed to do anything, and that the Israeli administration would accept that. So I would say that the Chinese, and they always tell us that they don't have influence. Of course they do. If they can do this deal, then of course they have influence. We also say that about DPRK, about North Korea. And the Chinese said, well, we have limited power there. So the Chinese can do a lot, but right now what they're doing is they're, I would say, capitalizing on their knowledge of Israel's concerns, fears, with the signing of this deal, expecting that that Jewish group, Israeli Jewish pressure group that David referenced, is going to go to the Biden administration and say, take the pressure off of China, so that China will stand with us at least more so when it comes to the JCPOA negotiation, et cetera. So I think it's quite a complex game of Go that David explained. Strategic encirclement is the principle behind that game. You don't try to kill anyone, take the king, nothing. So you just end up being surrounded. And it's a clever game, and the Chinese are quite good at it. But there are other factors that we haven't touched on that make it a challenge for China. And I just want to touch on it, and we can talk about it later if it's relevant, and that is allies and U.S. relations with allies. So I'll turn it over to you.
David?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, Benji, next question. You're on mute.
Apologies. And I think the next question is also for Carice, is why would the Israeli government allow the technion to build a technion-like university in China and all the implications of knowledge and technology transfer, given what the US has gone through and many other countries have gone through with IT problems and protecting the IT?
$130 million? Okay, so that was a bad deal for Israel. And it turns out, I just learned, before COVID, I was in China at the end of 2019. And I was having a meeting with a venture capital firm that is involved in a government project. And so we were having a conversation. And they explained to me that China's disappointed in the technion deal because the scholars are not doing research for the Chinese according to what they expected. And I have to tell you, a few things surprised me, but I was surprised. I was surprised that they were disappointed, and I was surprised that, I'm not so surprised that's what they were expecting, but surprised that they were expecting it so much that they would actually be disappointed. Why was it not a good deal for Israel? So first of all, the things that the technion agreed to teach were limited. It was circumspect. But the reason it was a bad deal is because China underpaid at the time, no longer relevant now because China's progressed so much since 2015 when that deal was completed. But at the time, it was the new engine of China's economy, because China said, we're going to create technology and commercialize it. Well, what does the technion do? That. And it's Jewish. So if you have this myth of the power of the Jews, and this is the only Jewish MIT in the world, and MIT wouldn't do this for China anyway, or Caltech or any of the others. So you have leverage, but because of Israel's lack of understanding of China's needs and how things work in China, unfortunately, President Peretz Levy did research with the wrong people instead of asking me. He went to the president of NYU and to Jaime Perez, who has a very wonderful name and gets a lot of investment money from China. And that was assumed to be bona fides for knowing how China works. It was not a good deal. I think that Israel needs to raise, Israel must raise its China capacity, because if Israel knows what it's doing with China, we become a worthy competitor, opponent, supplier, whatever it is. It will be better for China, better for the US, and better for Israel.
If I could add, the premise of the question is that China is mainly out to steal Western technology. That is a politically convenient thing for American politicians to say. The problem we have is not that China is stealing technology, and of course it does, but rather that China is now developing a great deal of its own technology, as exemplified by Huawei's dominance in 5G. And also China's advances in artificial intelligence. In the case of, for example, medical AI, applications of big data to pharmacology and similar things, China's got the most medical data in the world. They have hundreds of millions of digitized medical records, sequenced DNA, as well as a live feed of hundreds of millions of people taking vital signs on their smartphones. So there's no pharmaceutical research operation, academic or commercial, in the world that is not hook, line, and sinker in China, because you can't get the data anywhere else. The chief technology officer of Huawei told me in an interview in my book, this is the control point of the world economy, porting and storage of machine-readable data. In the last century, the control point was oil now it's data. So the idea that Israeli AI firms dealing with pharmacology can ignore China is simply utopia. What we should be doing is trying to leapfrog the Chinese and beat them at their own game. We tend to be better at innovation than they are when we put our minds to it. But the idea that China could be ignored by the Israelis, by the high-tech industry, is simply not a realistic proposition.
I just have to chip in and say, actually that was a Freudian slip there, because I want to talk about chips. I don't agree that data is the next oil. I think chips are the next oil, because you need the chips to use the data. So semiconductors is the next oil. Data is certainly very, very significant, but we have to keep an eye on the whole chip factor, and Taiwan's TSMC, the only chip manufacturing company in the world that can do 5 nano chips. Even Intel is stuck at 10. I just want to also throw in one more thing. In 2009, after the subprime meltdown, that was the impetus for China to say, okay, the West is sinking. I was literally in the room with the Chinese when they said, and this was 2012, they said we always looked to the West for answers, and we thought that they knew how to run everything well. Now we see they don't, and Chinese ways and Chinese ideas might have some legitimacy. And that was really the beginning of policy setting in a different direction, because the Chinese expected in 2009 for America to start to rebuild, to invest in research and development, to retrain its workers, to transform the country with innovation, to become strong and successful. And that did not happen. And when that did not happen, they read, the writing that was really neon on the wall.
Thank you. And the next question, actually, I'd like to defer to David. And if Iran stands to benefit from this massive deal with China, and more importantly, China will benefit from Iran, what incentive does China have to renegotiate JCPOA with the United States and the rest of the world if the sanctions pretty much make China, if not the only, then the main buyer of Iranian goods, and gives China more leverage?
It's an excellent question. Iran's exports to China went to nearly zero as of the middle of 2020. As long as China was negotiating with the United States on a wide range of issues, trade, technology, and so forth, the Chinese were at least nominally compliant with American sanctions on Iran. They did cheat a bit. A certain amount of Iranian oil was relabeled as Malaysian oil and so forth, but that was quite small. During the last 6 to 8 months, that's exploded. So the fact that the United States pushed Iran into a corner gave the Chinese the opportunity to tell the United States, there are things that are important to you, which we can mess up, and there isn't anything you can do about it. You have weak flanks that we can exploit. And I think that was a lacuna on the part of American strategy, the monopoly attitude, looking at things one hotel at a time, looking at Boardwalk and ignoring Park Place, so to speak. So yes, I think that certainly gave the Chinese an option. Now, from the standpoint of the Chinese, everything is negotiable. They are not ideologues like the Russians. They are looking to make themselves a dominant power economically, but they'll negotiate. If the US says, well, we'll back off on this, we'll take 50 Chinese companies off the entity list. If you do that, the Chinese will listen to it. Part of the problem we have is that the Biden administration, for better or worse, is only beginning to settle in. And it's very difficult to figure out who's in charge of China policy or any policy. And you're getting very contradictory messages out from the standpoint of the Chinese. They don't know what to put on the table at the moment. So they may try to get attention by doing things that we don't like and shouldn't like.
I just want to say that David couldn't be more right about the willingness to negotiate. The most important thing to China is reunification with Taiwan. And it's not something that, you know, the American people really are concerned about, you know, or pay attention to, or think what's the big deal. This is central to what the Chinese leadership thinks is its key to maintaining its power, which is why it's so important. There's a promise to reunite China, and Taiwan is part of that. So in gaining negotiating positions as tensions over Taiwan increase, the Iranian card is useful. That's one thing. The second thing is we have to say that both Iran and China much prefer to deal with America than each other. The reason the Iranians leaked that deal is they were very much hoping that the Americans would come back and that it would make their process easier in returning to the JCPOA. And the Chinese prefer to deal with the Americans because American it's a superpower. It is wealthy. It has a great deal to offer. And Iran has, you know, a lot of limitations with respect to, from China's perspective. So there are reasons why both of them want to return to the JCPOA.
Yes, and speaking of that involvement, many analysts believe that one of China's strategies around the world is to create all these projects or fund these projects and hope that poor countries aren't able to repay the loan and then take over infrastructure companies and other parts of these weak countries. What are their expectations in the Middle East, given the high GDP that many of these oil producing countries have? What's their strategy, and is it different than the rest of the world? And if so, how?
Well, you know, in the case of Africa, the Chinese have an incentive to own the mines. Remember, Africa is a place where the Chinese are interested strictly in extraction. They'll send in their teams, they'll bring in their own hammers, wheelbarrows, cooks, and so forth, keep them hermetically sealed from the local population because they're interested in raw materials and nothing else. The Middle East is a bit more complicated. China has a significant problem with Belt and Road Initiative. It's one of the worst managed things the Chinese have done. Internally, they're much better at managing things than abroad, and they have a great deal of bad debt and a great deal of inefficiency, partly because they're bullies, partly because there's corruption on the side, and partly because they're simply not used to dealing with that scale of business outside their own country. They're not people trained in the culture and the languages and so forth. So I don't believe that debt trap diplomacy is the important thing for China here, unlike Africa. Africa, you want the cobalt for the batteries. In the case of the Middle East, what you can get out of infrastructure in Iran or Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan is trivial. There aren't that many people in those places. There aren't that many resources. This is much more a matter of unifying Eurasia. And the Belt and Road aspect in Eurasia is directed towards Western Europe, which is wealthy, which has a lot of technology, which is an enormous prospective market for Chinese companies, and also a way of absorbing Western Europe. The German auto companies are gradually becoming Chinese auto companies. Their VW now sells more cars in China than anywhere else. So assimilating Western Europe with its enormous skills, its technology, its market, its wealth is much more important to them than taking over particular infrastructure projects in Central Asia.
Okay, but you asked about the Middle East, and I want to say that the debt trap myth is a myth. The idea that China set out to cause people to cause these countries to enter into too much debt is not, I don't believe that that's the case. What I do know is that China is opportunistic, and we see it here in Israel, where, for example, China's state-owned enterprise, Bright Food, purchased Tnuva, and everyone said, oh, you know, so what's the big deal? And only Ephraim Halevi said, well, you know, this could be a problem. But people laughed and said, what are they going to do, steal the cows? No, you don't know what is going to evolve. And you have to be tuned in and aware. And that's what I mean about being sensitive to China's different culture, different mindset, different mentality. What David described is that China has a gigantic toolbox, and they'll pull out the tools that they think will work with you. So this Tenuva deal, in and of itself, it was not great that we lost. You know, we have no more butter, but other companies stepped in, and et cetera. But and it was an amazing deal for the owners of Tenuva because China overpaid. But now, none of you probably know that through the access that Bright Food has with Tenuva, it was able to discover that there was a tender for a food tech incubator, a government tender, my tax shekels, in that government tender to build a food tech incubator in Kiryat Shmona, in very north of Israel, that was created by one of our former MKs named Ariel Margalit, who wanted to advance food tech and also bring to the north business and life and energy and motivation and excitement and innovation like Cyber did in the south, in the Negev. Well, Bright Food approached Ariel Margalit and said, we'd like to join your consortium. And there's a long story involved, but the bottom line is they went out to do, and I will tell anybody privately who's interested in the story, but the bottom line is they want the China, Ariel Margalit lost the tender, Bright Food won the tender, and in the agreement, it says that they should incubate at least 4 companies in the first year, if not 5. Only 1 was incubated as of the end of last year. And you could say it's Corona, but people can still be incubated. We were all working. I was working full-time the whole year. And on top of that, I want to stress that China has a food national security problem. Xi Jinping said a few months ago, we need a clean plate policy because they lost tens of thousands of acres of arable land to army worm, just now to red ants, another tens of thousands. Before that, and this is all like since 2019, floods, another tens of thousands, and before that, swine flu. And China was hungry until 40 years ago. So Israel's lack of understanding that food is a national security issue for China, if you don't understand that, you don't know how to deal with the interest in a food tech incubator. So that's Tenuva.
Okay. Is there time for one more question, Benji? Do you have one more?
Yes, we can do one last question, and it's related to the Sino-Persian agreement. That it was leaked that China would send vaccines to Iran once it signed the conditions tied to the agreement. And the question is this behavior a sign of the future of the Chinese way of conducting their business or doing their international engagements with other countries around the world?
Certainly. China is interested in using soft power. It's emulating the West in that respect. It wants to be viewed as benevolent. The problem is the Chinese tend to be such bullies that they often obviate the effects of the favors they do for people. But certainly the vaccine diplomacy has been important for them. But I don't think that's really the key to China's power. The key to China's power is that it's the majority of growth in the world economy right now. It's the biggest import market for Western Europe. It's the biggest source of electronics to the United States. Our trade deficit with China is now bigger than it ever has been before. And it's simply the pure economic might that makes it impossible to get around. When we talk about decoupling the semiconductor industry from China, the Semiconductor Industry Association estimated that that would cost $1 trillion and raise prices by 60%. Now, I don't know if that estimate is correct, but I don't think it's off by a gigantic amount. It's very difficult to ignore the elephant in the parlor, and in the world economy, that's what China has become.
Last one second to say, you have to go one step behind what David said. Everything is true, but the thing behind that is China's true power is in what I said earlier with respect to what allows it to become so economically powerful. If you have hundreds of millions of people, adults, who are willing to work hard, you don't have that in America, I'm sorry. You know, as you know, I'm originally American, and but Americans don't work hard the way the Chinese do. And there are not hundreds of millions of adults in America. There's 350 million people, A to Z. So when you have that kind of, you're driven, and the Chinese are driven, and I can tell you a lot of stories on all kinds of levels. And that's why their economic success is so widespread. I mean, they do better. They go out into the world and they're doing better than everybody who they're working, who are their competitors. So we have a challenge.
Yes. Okay. We definitely have a challenge. I feel after this discussion that our appetites are just whet for more. I knew it would be a treat to hear you, David Goldman, because we've had you on before, and I feel it's also a treat to hear you, Carice, because you really do have a phenomenal amount of knowledge on this subject, and I want to thank you both, you know, tremendously for. And I do want also for people to sign up for Carice's newsletter. And it Signal. How do you get it? Signal.
If you write to Julia at Sino-Israel.org.
Okay, excellent, excellent. And I would really recommend for everybody to read David Goldman's book, You Will Be Assimilated. And I think we all should start learning Chinese right now. Thank you so much to both of you. I also would like to put in a plug for next Tuesday when we have Yoram Ettinger at 12 noon. Yoram, of course, is an old and dear friend of mine and of EMET's, and he is actually a better historian of American-Israeli diplomacy than any American I know. And he will be talking about what is going on today in the relationships between the Biden administration and the state of Israel, and put it in a wider perspective of diplomatic history, which I always find to be reassuring. And I thank you so much to all of our hundreds of viewers that have tuned in today. And if you would like to support Signal, how does one go about doing that, Carice?
Write to Julia, we'll tell you how.
Okay, and of course, EMET does all of this as a public service because we really do believe that a well-informed public does trickle up to hopefully well-informed policymakers. And if you would like to support EMET, we could really use your support. Thank you very, very, very much. This has been an amazingly stimulating and thoughtful discussion.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much. It was outstanding. David, thank you.
Thanks. Be well. Bye-bye.